This took place in early September of 2018, during my second year at university. At the time, I was 20 years old, and several people that I had grown up with locally, 3 friends, Marek, Thomas, and Pavel, remained in regular contact despite attending different schools. Most weekends, we met to drink alcohol outdoors rather than in a bar, but primarily to avoid cost and attention for the most part. One Saturday afternoon, we decided to travel by car to a wooded area, roughly 6 kilometers from town. The site was adjacent to decommissioned agricultural land and bordered, at a distance, by a low-security correctional work facility. This detail was known to us, but was not considered significant at the time, as the area was accessible by public trails and frequently used during daylight hours by others too. Anyway, we entered the forest shortly after midday. Visibility was inconsistent due to dense growth and uneven terrain, but there was no immediate sense of danger by any means, and so we walked off the marked path and continued deeper for maybe about 40 minutes, stopping intermittently to drink some water and talk a little bit. There was no clear objective beyond exploring and passing some time, but eventually we encountered a structure that was inconsistent with recreational use of the area. It was a small shelter, constructed from stacked timber and sheet metal, roughly circular in layout, with a partially collapsed roof. Adjacent to it was a fire pit containing ash that appeared recent. Scattered around the site were food containers, plastic bottles, and discarded fabric. There was no sign or indication that the area was designated for camping or anything. We discussed possible explanations, including illegal camping or use by transient laborers, but at the time none of us really suggested notifying authorities. I mean, the shelter was open on one side, and it contained some hand tools, and placed against the interior wall there were a few things. These included cutting tools and metal bars showing signs of wear. Rather than leaving immediately, we made a poor decision, though, to treat the site as abandoned. We removed several of the tools and carried them further into the forest, where we attempted to assemble a basic frame structure of our own. The effort was pretty uncoordinated and very short-lived, but by early evening, we lost interest and left the tools where they were, intending to return to them later, and then we exited the forest before dark. Now, the following weekend, we returned with the intention of using the original fire pit. We arrived later in the day, probably around sunset, bringing some food and flammable materials this time. When we reached the initial site, the shelter, though, it had been dismantled. The materials were not removed, but broken apart and scattered. The fire pit had been filled with dirt, and we inferred that someone must have discovered the tools missing and reacted by destroying the shelter or something. Despite this, though, we decided to continue. We moved maybe 30 minutes east to a more concealed location, dug a shallow pit, and started a fire. For a period, too, nothing unusual occurred. We drank some alcohol and we talked a little bit. One person was playing some music quietly, and after roughly about an hour, we observed multiple light sources moving through the forest at a distance all of a sudden. Soon after, we heard raised voices. The lights appeared to be handheld and were approaching deliberately rather than randomly. It became clear, too, that several adult men were moving toward our location. Their progress was slow due to the vegetation, but they were definitely coordinated. At this point, there was a disagreement among our group as well. 2 of us, including myself, believed immediate retreat was necessary. The other 2 felt running would draw attention and preferred to stay hidden. In the end, because of this too, we split up, and I left with Marek and moved south, deeper into the forest, attempting to avoid the lights. We used a single flashlight intermittently and shielded it as much as we could, and we sustained minor cuts while moving at speed, but after about 20 minutes, we reached a livestock fence marking the edge of the private land. Voices were still audible behind us, and with no clear path around, we crossed the fence, sustaining additional injuries in the process. But once on the other side, we followed the fence line until we reached an opening that led toward a service road. We didn't have phone signal and we couldn't contact the others, so We debated calling the police, but decided against it due to our own involvement in illegal fire use. Eventually, we exited the wooded area near some residential housing and we waited under the streetlight. Several minutes later, Thomas and Pavel emerged from a different location, and they reported that they had hidden near the fire site while the men arrived. According to them, the men were older, carrying metal tools, and were very verbally aggressive. But after searching briefly, they moved away from the fire toward a pickup truck parked along a logging track, leaving the area temporarily unoccupied. Thomas and Pavel then fled in the opposite direction. We left the area after that together, and we didn't return that night. But here's where things get a little creepy. So, we didn't go back to that place for some time, and eventually, though, we found news reports about apparent bodies being buried in that forest. Allegedly, the cops had found some remains down there, and apparently they looked human. We never did really follow up with what that was all about, but I remember at the time feeling like we maybe had avoided being murdered or something. I don't know if those men were responsible for that, obviously, or maybe if it was someone else, but still, the fact that we were there that night, that those guys came out of nowhere, and the fact that human remains have been found there, well, it doesn't take much to put two and two together. At the time that this happened, I was 19 years old and employed full-time in a commercial district inside of the Netherlands. I lived in a rural municipality about 30 minutes away by rail, and because parking near my workplace was restricted and expensive, I commuted daily by train and left my car at a small station near my own home village. My return commute, it usually ended between 7 and 7:45. During the winter, though, the station was poorly lit and it consisted of a single platform, a short access road, and an open gravel lot used for parking. There was one functioning light pole near the ticket machine, and passenger traffic at that hour was pretty limited, often fewer than 5 people disembarking. Now, on the evening in question, the train was nearly empty. I was wearing headphones and not paying attention to other passengers, and when the train stopped, I exited alone, to my knowledge at least. I didn't see anyone else step onto the platform with me, though visibility was pretty limited, I'll admit. To reach my car, I had to cross the tracks via a pedestrian path and walk maybe about 100 meters along the access road. While doing so, I noticed a dark-colored delivery vehicle parked near the edge of the lot. This was not unusual, as nearby residents occasionally use the station for short stops. As I continued walking, though, the vehicle began moving slowly alongside of me. I initially assumed the driver was repositioning or maybe preparing to leave or something. The vehicle matched my walking speed for maybe about several seconds. I turned my head and saw an older man in the driver's seat, likely in his late 50s or early 60s, gesturing toward me. I removed one headphone and he spoke through the open window and asked whether I needed a ride home, stating that it was cold and unsafe to be walking alone like this. His tone was calm but unsolicited. I declined and told him that my car was just parked up ahead anyway. I replaced my headphones and I continued toward the lot. The vehicle didn't immediately depart though. Instead, it rolled forward slightly, then stopped again. I became aware that the driver was watching the surrounding area rather than focusing on me. Moments later, he accelerated away from the station without any explanation. As the vehicle left, I noticed another individual walking several meters behind me. This person appeared to be a man in his 20s or maybe 30s. I hadn't seen him on the platform, though, and couldn't determine whether he had exited the train or maybe had approached from another direction. He didn't speak to me and maintained distance, continuing toward the parking area. I reached my car without incident and locked the doors immediately after entering. Before starting the engine, I remained seated though and observed the surroundings for about several minutes. The delivery vehicle did return as well, circling around the area, maybe looking for me perhaps. And the man walking, he ended up talking to the guy in the vehicle as if they knew each other. Then the men passed through the lot and continued down the road. At home, I replayed the sequence of events and considered alternative explanations. The offer of a ride could have been genuine. The departure of the vehicle could have been unrelated. However, the timing and the behavior, none of it felt coincidental. The following week, too, I mentioned the incident to a co-worker who lived nearby, and she told me that local police had recently issued informal warnings about a vehicle matching a similar description, approaching young women near transit stops in surrounding villages. No arrests had been made and the details were limited, but apparently this was a bit of a warning. I didn't end up filing a report in the end, and no direct threat had occurred, and I had no identifying information beyond a general vehicle type, I guess. But I did alter my routine afterward by parking closer to the platform, removing the headphones before exiting the train, and also coordinating rides home when I could. I never did see the vehicle or the driver again, but I did hear of stories of women who allegedly were almost kidnapped by a vehicle around this area. That definitely matched the description of the one that I had seen. This situation developed over several months. At the time, my partner, Laura, was 19 years old and living alone in a regional town in western Germany. I lived in a neighboring state, about 90 minutes away by car, and Laura didn't own a vehicle at the time and relied on walking and public transport for daily travel. Laura worked part-time at a mid-sized home goods retailer located along a commercial strip near a residential area. Her schedule was pretty consistent, typically late afternoon into evening, and the store was within walking distance of her apartment, and she followed the same route each day. Near the end of her employment at that location, she began noticing a repeat customer. The individual did not approach staff directly and never spoke to her, but they would enter the store shortly before closing, select one or two inexpensive items, and remain inside longer than really was necessary. Their behavior was weird too. They would stare at Laura while maintaining physical distance. The individual had visible facial abnormalities that made them immediately identifiable too. Their mouth remained partially open at rest and their teeth protruded noticeably. Laura also observed cosmetic residue around their lips that appeared intentionally applied. And while unusual, this alone did not initially raise concern, as the retail environment involved frequent contact with very unfamiliar people. The concern, though, escalated after the home goods store closed permanently. You see, Laura accepted a position at a supermarket located in the same sort of commercial zone, really. It was about 200 meters away for the most part, and within days of starting that new job, the same individual appeared at the supermarket. From that point forward, the pattern became very consistent too. The individual would arrive shortly after Laura's shift began, remain inside the store for extended periods of time without browsing or doing anything really, and then leave at nearly the same time each visit, always within a few minutes of 9:30 p.m. Purchases were minimal and very repetitive, often limited to a single canned item and basic bread. Laura, though, documented that this behavior occurred regardless of weekday or weekend schedules, and on days when she worked earlier shifts, the individual didn't appear. When her schedule returned to evenings, the visits resumed immediately, though. Now, this person never really acknowledged Laura directly, and when eye contact occurred, they would turn away and move to another aisle. However, their body orientation and movement suggested continued monitoring. In fact, on one occasion, Laura took an unscheduled 3-day break due to illness, and when she returned, this person entered the store near closing time, appeared to scan the checkout area repeatedly, and only relaxed their posture once Laura was visible. Laura reported this behavior to the store management, and the response, as you can probably imagine, was very dismissive. No formal report was filed and no action was taken, despite the behavior meeting internal criteria for suspicious customer activity. What increased the perceived risk, though, was not any single action, but the persistence and the precision of the timing of everything. This person appeared to know her schedule, but never appeared early enough to plausibly discover it in store, and this always raised the possibility of external observation, either from the parking area or maybe along Laura's walking route. Now, one evening, Laura noticed the individual standing outside of the store after closing, positioned near the edge of the lot rather than the entrance. They never did approach her, but they remained stationary until she was collected by a co-worker offering a ride, and the person left immediately afterward without entering the store. But that night, Laura experienced something strange at home. So it must have been around midnight when she said that she heard somebody or something tapping on the side of the house. She went to take a look but didn't see anyone, and so initially she thought that maybe it was an animal or maybe one of the trees out the back that was tapping the house on the side of it or something. But about 5 minutes later, she swears that she heard the front doorknob being tried. It wasn't aggressive or anything, but it certainly sounded like it, is what she said to me. She contacted the police at that point, and they came out and checked the area, but by the time that they got there was no one there apparently. Within weeks of this, Laura resigned from the job and relocated to live with me. Since the move as well, there have been no further incidents. While no direct threat was ever made, and also there was no real law enforcement reports ever made too, because, well, there just wasn't really much to go off. The behavior of this person met several indicators of targeted fixation. Repeated location transfer, schedule alignment, emotional response to absence, and avoidance of overt interaction, with the potential of this person stalking Laura all the way back home and even trying to break into her house. All of it exceeded what could reasonably be classified as coincidence or just benign interest. The situation only ended because Laura removed herself from the environment too, and whether it would have escalated further remains unknown, but the absence of closure doesn't reduce the concern for sure. I guess, really, it just simply marks the point at which the opportunity finally ceased. When I was around 8 years old, my family lived on the ground floor of an apartment complex. The building was pretty old, with thin interior walls and inconsistent lighting due to frequent electrical issues. But one Friday evening, my parents allowed me to have several classmates stay over. There were 5 of us in all boys from the primary school. The evening followed a predictable routine: takeaway food, console games, and noise complaints from the downstairs neighbor. Sleeping arrangements, they were pretty much improvised as well. 2 beds were already in the room, mine and my older cousins, who lived with us temporarily, and some additional mattresses were placed on the floor. The door was closed but not locked, and the hallway light outside the room was left on, as was pretty common when guests stayed over. Everyone fell asleep gradually, and I remained awake longer than the others, partly due to excitement and also partly because I always had difficulty sleeping in noisy environments. I was sitting upright against my bed frame, looking through some magazines using a small desk lamp angled toward the wall. Shortly after turning off the lamp, I noticed a change in the light pattern on the opposite wall. The hallway light was still on, and something was sort of partially blocking it. At first I assumed someone had walked past the room, but then the obstruction stopped moving. What appeared on the wall was the silhouette of an adult-sized person crouched low, close to the floor. The shape was not static, and it sort of shifted slightly as if adjusting balance, but I could see the outline of shoulders and an arm extended forward. The position of the arm aligned with where one of my classmates was, Martin. He was sleeping closest to the door, and I didn't hear footsteps or breathing, but the shadow clearly changed shape, suggesting movement rather than a fixed object or passing light or something like that. I didn't call out. At that age, my response was just to remain still. I remember thinking at the time that drawing attention would probably make the situation worse. The shadow moved once more, briefly obscuring the light completely, and then withdrew. The hallway light returned to its original brightness. I didn't see anyone leave, and the door did not open or close. I stayed awake for the remainder of the night after that, though, and there were no additional sounds or anything, but I just couldn't sleep. My attention remained fixed on that doorway until morning, in fact. At breakfast, I checked the hallway and the living room, but nothing appeared disturbed. I asked both of my parents whether either of them had checked on us during the night, and they said no. My father had worked a night shift, and my mother had gone to bed early with a migraine, apparently, and so I told my friends what I had seen. Most dismissed it immediately. Martin, however, said that he remembered waking briefly and sort of feeling pressure near his shoulder, but assumed another child had rolled onto him or something. Later that morning, Martin was collected early by his aunt instead of his parents, which was pretty unusual. I overheard my mother speaking quietly with her in the entryway, and after everyone had left, I asked why Martin had gone home ahead of schedule that day. My mother told me that apparently there had been a death in the family overnight. His grandfather, who had lived in the same apartment block but in a different stairwell, had died sometime after midnight. Emergency services had attended the building, but unfortunately he was just gone. No further explanation was offered, and at the time I didn't connect this information to what I had seen, but in the following weeks I paid close attention to that hallway light and the space under my door. Nothing similar ever happened again, but years later I learned that the building had a history of unauthorized entry due to a faulty rear door that often failed to latch properly. Residents had reported individuals wandering the corridors at night, usually relatives or acquaintances of tenants or whatnot. And so, when I think back about that moment, I often wonder if it was maybe a person had broken in or something, or maybe it was something more paranormal. Really, I'm not sure what to make of it, but I know that I saw someone there, and that's what really sits with me all these years later. We arrived at the hotel on a Friday evening, about 2 weeks ago. I had chosen it because it was close to the conference that I was attending, and because it was one of the few places with the rooms were still available at a reasonable rate. I had read reviews warning about the building's age, poor maintenance, and an atmosphere that some guests described as oppressive. I didn't believe those accounts until we arrived. The property was a large mid-20th century resort near Lake Tahoe, built during the casino boom and never fully renovated. The lobby was dim and smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke. The elevators were slow, and everything about this place was run down. It looked like it had been patched together over time without any real cohesive maintenance plan. We checked in at around 9 p.m. and we were assigned a suite on the 18th floor. The room itself seemed normal initially. Clean sheets, functioning appliances, and a working air conditioner too. That all changed though after we left for dinner and we returned later that night. The first thing that felt wrong was the temperature. The suite was unusually warm, and the thermostat was set at 28 degrees Celsius or 82 degrees Fahrenheit. We had not touched it, and the air conditioner was running, but it just never really lowered the temperature. It took 2 hours before the room finally dropped to at least a comfortable level. I noted the issue, but I assumed it was just a faulty thermostat or maybe a maintenance error. We went to the casino area for about an hour though, and while my partner played a table game, I walked to a nearby slot machine. I felt a persistent sensation that somebody was observing me, but there was no visible reason for it. The casino was busy and the noise level was high, which should have been enough to distract me, but instead I kept turning my head, expecting to see someone directly behind me. And then I heard my name. It wasn't whispered, it was spoken clearly, from a direction behind me. It sounded like someone who knew me personally, and so I turned immediately, but there was no one within 10 meters of me. The nearest people were other guests and staff, none of whom were looking at me. There was no one that I recognized, but that feeling, it didn't go away. I told myself that it was fatigue and that I was simply anxious because of the environment or something like that. I went back to the room and the temperature issue had returned. The thermostat was again set high without any explanation. The next day, we spent most of our time outside of the building. We were on the 18th floor in the West Tower, and our hallway was consistently empty. There were no guests walking by, and no staff, no cleaning carts or anything like that. Quiet should have been welcome, I know that, but it just made the environment feel like it had been abandoned. When the hallway was empty too, I felt watched more intensely than even in the casino. The silence, it amplified every sound, including our footsteps. I avoided leaving the room alone. The corridor light was low and the carpet had worn patches that made the space feel really neglected. The elevator ride was always intense, even when other people were present. The air inside felt heavier than it should have, and I found myself rushing back into the room as if the hallway was a transitional space that I needed to get through quickly. The suite itself was large, but the living area felt uninviting. I stayed in the bedroom almost exclusively, and my partner and I began to argue more than usual. The tone of our conversations, well, it changed from normal stress to something sharper and way more resentful. It was not one specific issue, too. It was the accumulation of small irritations, I guess you could say. I also noticed a consistent sense of dread and an unease that neither of us could explain. At night, I slept with the lights on there. The room was quiet, but I heard noises like somebody pressing buttons or toggling switches all night. It sounded like a phone keypad or maybe a wall-mounted control panel being used. I didn't have any electronic device active that could make those sounds, but the noises occurred repeatedly, usually when I was trying to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke before my partner did, and I heard those same noises again, coming from the living area this time. It sounded like deliberate pressing, not random creaks as well. I checked the room and found nothing out of place. I didn't tell my partner because I didn't want to appear irrational, and we were arguing at the time too. My mother was staying in the same building on a different floor, and she told me that she saw a man in a light-colored hat near a restricted service corridor behind the food court, and when she looked again, that he was apparently gone. She described the area as usually empty and off-limits to guests, but by the third day, both of us felt incredibly drained. I had no appetite, and I felt nauseated without a clear reason for being that way. My partner, who rarely experiences depressive thoughts, said that he felt an overwhelming sadness and a sense of hopelessness while we were there. He described it as a weight pressing in on him and said that it made him question our relationship in a way that he had never done before. And so, after all of this, we left a day early. After we returned home, the feelings did not immediately disappear. I continued to feel unusually tense and exhausted for several days. I began researching the hotel's history and found reports of frequent mechanical failures, electrical issues, and a pattern of guests complaining about oppressive atmospheres and sudden mood changes. I also found a few local news items referencing accidental deaths and a handful of violent incidences in the area over the decades, but nothing that directly connected to our suite. Still though, I have not returned to that place, and I don't plan to either. The experience did not produce a clear answer by any means, but it did change my perception of that place for sure. It demonstrated how an environment like that can influence your mood so much, and even your behavior in a way that feels like something more than just bad vibes. I was 21 at the time that this happened, and my then girlfriend and I were staying at my parents' house while they were away. We were there to look after the family's 2 dogs. So my grandparents had died 6 months earlier, and my parents had moved some of their furniture into the house temporarily. Most of the items were stored in my parents' bedroom, which was across the living room and clearly visible from the couch. A small antique mirror from my grandparents was placed in the hallway between the kitchen and the living room. It looked out of place and had a sort of odd presence in the space. Both dogs refused to go near that bedroom, though. They would approach the doorway, sniff, and then retreat quickly every single time. They didn't show fear elsewhere in the house, and only around that room, and only since that stuff had been moved in there. The atmosphere there was consistently tense as well, but I didn't pay too much attention to it, until the first incident, that is. So during our stay, both of us caught a very severe flu. I had a very high fever and a throat infection, and my girlfriend was also unwell, though not as bad as I was. We spent most of the days inside, sleeping and just resting. I was particularly disoriented because I was running a fever and had trouble concentrating, but one evening we were on the couch watching a comedy film. The dogs were lying beside us, and my girlfriend fell asleep at some stage. And as I was drifting off, I heard a deliberate throat clear from the hallway area near the antique chair. It was a distinct ahem sort of sound, sharp and intentional. At first, I assumed it was a symptom of my illness or a dream or something, but that's when I noticed that the dogs reacted immediately too. Both dogs lifted their heads and stared toward the hallway, their ears forward, and they were clearly alert. I whispered to my girlfriend, "Did you hear that?" She woke up and said, "Yes, was that you?" I told her that it wasn't me. We stayed quiet after that, both of us unsettled, and we didn't discuss it further that night. The following day, we were still sick and pretty lethargic. I spent the day playing a video game while my girlfriend rested, and at one point I noticed the oldest dog, Elsa, was missing. I searched the house, checking each room methodically, and eventually I entered my parents' bedroom to look for her. The room was dark and still. The bed was made, but in the center of it was a wire laundry basket placed perfectly flat. It was a lightweight metal mesh basket, and I did not recall moving it there. It looked like somebody had deliberately set it there, but Elsa was not in the room, and I later found her under a blanket in the living room. That evening, we returned to the living room with the dogs, and probably around 10:30 at night, we decided to go to bed, and the dogs followed us into my old room and settled down, and as soon as we lay down, we heard a loud crash come from somewhere inside of the house. The sound was heavy enough, too, to make us both sit up immediately. I shouted, "What was that? Did someone break in?" So I quickly grabbed a kitchen knife and started checking the house. I moved slowly, room by room, trying not to cough as I was going, keeping my eyes on every corner. The dogs followed me, and they were visibly tense too. I found nothing unusual in the kitchen or the living room. In fact, the house was quiet. I began to doubt myself and wondered if my illness was causing paranoia or something, but when I reached my parents' bedroom, I saw the wire basket from earlier, but it was now on the floor, upside down. The bed had a very thick mattress and soft bedding, and there was just no way that that basket could have fallen off the bed like that, at least not without enough force to cause a loud crash unless it was pushed or thrown or something. The basket was also positioned in a way that suggested that it had been flipped and dropped, not just randomly pushed. I called my girlfriend into the room. She looked at it and didn't speak for a while. We both stood there trying to make sense of it. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere, no footprints in the snow outside. I did check that, even though I was running a fever, and no other noises. We didn't see anyone, and the dogs remained very tense, and they just refused to enter the bedroom. After that night, though, we left early, and we didn't stay the last day that we were supposed to. We told ourselves that it was stress and illness, but the incidents just didn't fit a rational pattern by any means. The experiences still stay with me too, and I still don't have a clear explanation for what happened that day, and I haven't returned to that house since then, at least not alone, that is. It's not a story that I tell often as well, because It feels too close to the possibility that something was watching us or testing boundaries in a way that was not purely psychological, and I'm just not really comfortable with that sort of answer to the whole thing. I'm certainly not someone who believes in the paranormal by any means, and so the whole thing was just really odd, and again, I just still do not have an explanation for any of it. I didn't plan to move back into the family farm. I only agreed because my husband and I were running out of options. We were living in a rented house in rural Pennsylvania when my grandmother died in 2015. The property had been empty for almost a decade after that, and my grandfather had passed in 2004, and after that my grandmother stayed alone until she died. The house, it belonged to my family trust, and the land, 165 acres, was still technically ours, but nobody was living there. I returned to the property in late 2025 because we had no other choice. My husband had taken a remote job and I was working from home. The plan was simple: move in, clean up, sell what we didn't need, and either renovate or sell the house. I told myself that I was only doing it for practical reasons, but I was aware of the stories. The house had been described as haunted for generations, and I grew up hearing the accounts from my mother and her siblings. They always spoke about it like a family secret, something that they didn't want to be real but couldn't deny. My grandfather was the only person in the family who ever said that he felt comfortable there. My grandmother and her siblings all said that they felt uneasy upstairs. They described doors opening by themselves, footsteps at night, and voices coming from rooms that were empty. My aunts and uncles always said that it was just the house settling, but the accounts continued for decades, and the stories didn't stop after my grandmother's death too. When I was a child, I didn't want to sleep in the upstairs room. I always felt watched up there. I could never really explain it, especially as a kid, but my siblings still refused to stay there overnight, and that has never changed. When my husband and I moved in September of 2025, the house was empty and quiet. It had been vacant for years, and the only people who had been inside were the small group of my grandfather's friends who came for deer season every fall, and that was pretty much it. They would stay for a weekend and sleep on the downstairs addition rather than the upstairs. They always said that they heard footsteps and doors upstairs. They said that they smelled cigar smoke in the living room, even though my grandfather had not been there in years. And their stories were not about ghosts, but they were about something in the house that made them always feel unsafe. I told my husband all of this before we moved in, but he just didn't care. He assumed it was just family lore, and he also assumed that the stories were exaggerated, and that it was just a normal old house. Well, that all changed very fast. Within the first week, we noticed the master bedroom door would open and close on its own. It wasn't a slow swing as well, it was a repeated movement, like something or someone was pushing it intentionally. We did check for drafts and we checked the vents and all that. We checked the latch and the hinges, but there was just no way that we could explain it. At first, we sort of laughed about it, to be honest. My husband joked that it was just the house waking up. Our dogs didn't like it, though. One of them would sit staring at the door as if waiting for it to move again, and at night, my husband heard footsteps above our bedroom. He described them as heavy, like boots. He never woke me, and he assumed it was the house, but he didn't believe in the stories, and he told himself that it was just nothing. But I can assure you that it was not nothing. I started to feel the difference in the air too. Not a spiritual sensation, but just a real physical sense of being watched. It was the kind of feeling that you get when you realize that you're not alone in a place where you should have been. We also had a mouse problem there, and we heard sounds in the kitchen, items were moved, and there was tapping inside the walls. The dogs reacted as if something was in the house, and we hired an exterminator eventually, and the mice were gone by the end of September. But the noises, they never stopped. Door activity continued. The upstairs door would just open randomly. The downstairs door would open randomly now too. We started latching doors because the dogs were afraid of the stairs, and the dogs would just not go upstairs no matter how much you tried to coax them up there. They just refused. Now, during October, we were involved in a legal dispute with a group of trespassers. They had been using our property for hunting and timber harvesting without permission. It escalated into police reports and threats, and one of the trespassers told my husband, "The boys will take care of you." After that, we returned home one afternoon to find the patio furniture overturned. The dogs were absolutely frantic, and my husband assumed that someone had tried to break in. We installed security systems and changed the locks and all that. We didn't think about the house itself being responsible at the time, but the next day, the doors were open again. Not the patio door, but the kitchen door, the back door. The dogs were again agitated, and they refused to go outside through the open door, and that was the first time that we realized that the dogs were reacting to something inside of the house, not outside. That was also the point when I stopped assuming that everything about the patio situation had to do with these guys trying to break in or intimidate us. In November, the front door began locking itself too when my husband stepped outside. The door did not lock automatically, and you had to turn the latch, but it was happening without anyone touching it. We always assumed it was the other person, like I assumed my husband was locking it and he assumed that I was locking it. But after it happened a dozen or so times, we stopped making assumptions like that. Instead, we started making rules. One person had to stay inside if the other left, and we also kept a spare key in our pockets at all times. Now one day, we were about to leave for groceries when the garage door opened in front of us. The garage door was electric, but the opener never worked. The door opened without anyone touching it, which was really weird. That same month, we came home from a short trip to find the back door wide open. The dogs were absolutely mental, barking, and still they had not left the house. The door was open from the inside, but nothing was missing. Nothing was stolen. The dogs never calmed down. I mean, they genuinely seemed scared, too. We began to see a pattern. The house was moving things, opening doors, causing the dogs to react, and it was no longer subtle by any means. The dog's behavior became the most alarming thing, though. Our scent hound started staring at the kitchen wall, growling at nothing. The sheepdog that we had, a guardian breed, began sleeping in the entryway between the living room and the kitchen. She would not leave that spot, and she only ever moved if we moved. She watched the kitchen all night, and we tried to sleep with the dogs in our bedroom, but the dogs just always panicked. They would scratch at the door and bark, and they would not stay inside. At that point, my husband began to stop laughing at the stories, and he began to take it a bit more seriously. Eventually, we contacted a team to investigate. The team arrived in the morning, and we locked the dogs in the master bedroom because they bark at strangers. And while we were talking, 2 separate knocking incidents occurred. The first knock came from the back of the house. It was loud and rhythmic, 4 knocks. We assumed that someone was at the back door, but there was no one there. The second knock, that came from the master bedroom door while we were standing in the kitchen. It was the same pattern, and we could hear it clearly, all of us in fact. The dogs were locked inside, and they could not have made the sound. The team members and we all heard it, mind you, and the sound was not a door hitting the frame or anything. It was deliberate. It sounded like somebody knocking from the other side of a door, and we later checked the door, but there was nothing wrong with the latch, and there was no evidence of somebody trying to get in or anything. During the Christmas break, our children came to stay, and everyone was sick with a cold at that time. And we were all in the kitchen when 3 events all happened simultaneously. The microwave suddenly made a loud pop. A kitchen knife fell from its magnetic strip onto the counter, and a spoon literally flew across the kitchen and hit my husband directly in the back. We all heard it and saw it, and there was no way that any of us could explain it. Mind you, too, it was not a prank or a loose knife or anything, and the spoon was on the counter on the opposite side of the room. The knife was hanging securely, and Nobody was near the kitchen. The kids were all sort of sitting nearby around the table. We tried to recreate it too, but we just couldn't. The spoon never moved, the knife never fell, and nothing caused the sound. The team that we had hired eventually installed cameras and audio recorders for 3 weeks as well, and they kept the equipment running when we were out and asleep and all that. The result was anything but normal too. Audio recordings captured repeated sounds of footsteps and slamming doors. Motion cameras triggered without any visible cause. Cameras captured an object moving in a loop through the dining room and then disappearing into the ceiling. The temperature sensors recorded sudden drops of more than 10 degrees in multiple rooms, just all of a sudden. The drops were always short, but they never did correlate to outside temperature or drafts or anything. But the most unsettling part was that the activity was not consistent. It didn't follow a pattern and it didn't repeat the same actions. In fact, it was really erratic. And that meant that it was not simply a structural issue or a normal house settling sort of thing. It also meant that it was not tied to any other person. In the end too, the team concluded that it was not a demonic presence. They ruled out a human spirit because the activity predated the deaths in the house, and they also found no record of any burial sites or settlements on the property. They ruled out a poltergeist tied to a specific person, and in the end, they just could not explain what it actually was. The only reasonable theory was that something had attached itself to the house and that it had been there for over a century at this point. The activity, though, definitely all centered around the upstairs bedroom and the kitchen directly below it, and it seemed to focus on opening and closing doors, moving objects, and creating disturbances in those areas. We never did solve what this problem was, and we never tried to, exorcise it or anything. We didn't drive it away, and the only thing that we did was make the house more livable, I suppose. We installed security systems, added salt lines across thresholds. We didn't believe in any of this stuff, but we tried it. We just tried to prevent the house from, taking control in the end. The house never stopped completely too, but the activity did decrease a little bit. The dog stopped reacting as intensely, the door stopped opening randomly as often, and the knocking eventually stopped. We still live there as well, and we still feel uneasy sometimes. We hear noises that make us stop and listen, but we've learned to live with it, I suppose. Like you learn to live with a dangerous animal on the property or something. Never fully trusting it, but always respecting it and always keeping the doors locked. We're not sure if the intensity will return or not, but we only know that it's been here longer than any of us have been alive, and I think that that is probably what scares me the most. I never really planned on sharing any of this publicly. It's not something that I really talk about often because it just doesn't sound believable at all, and I've always been the kind of person who avoids exaggeration and things like this. But I keep thinking about it, and I've never been able to explain what happened, so if you have any ideas, then I would genuinely love to hear them. So my family's house was a farmhouse in rural Idaho. It was built in the late 1800s and had been used as a working dairy farm at some point in its history. The property sat alone on a long stretch of land, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. The house had several floors if you counted the basement and the attic. The basement was unfinished, the main floor had the living room and the kitchen, and the second floor had bedrooms and an office, and the attic was accessible only by a narrow stairwell. The first time that I experienced something that I couldn't rationalize there was when I was 16. My parents were out and my two brothers were downstairs, and I was working on a school project in the upstairs office. I needed something from the kitchen, so I went to go down the stairs, and the landing led directly to my parents' bedroom. Their door was closed, and as soon as I stepped onto the first stair, I heard a female voice whisper, "Help me." It wasn't muffled or distant at all, and it was clear, urgent, and panicked. I assumed it was one of my brothers trying to scare me, so I immediately went back up the stairs and opened the door, but there was nobody inside. I checked the house, called out for my brothers, and found them downstairs, and they didn't hear anything. They weren't even in the room. No one had been in my parents' bedroom. There was no way to explain the voice as a prank. There was no way to explain the voice. There was no sound source, and I felt a sense of dread, and I left the house as soon as I could after that. That wasn't the only time something strange happened there, but it was the first time that I realized that the house didn't behave like a normal one did. Over the years, too, I had 3 different people independently report seeing the same figure in the house. They were not connected, mind you, and they didn't even know each other well enough to coordinate a story. That's what made it so unsettling as well. The first was a friend named John, not his real name, obviously. He said that he had seen a woman inside of the house multiple times. He described her as having shoulder-length brown hair and wearing a purple dress. He said that she looked like an older, more worn version of a woman in the film The Others, the same kind of dress and posture. The second was my ex-sister-in-law, Hannah. She told me that she saw the same woman in the attic, and she used the same details even. Brown hair, purple dress, and a calm expression. She said that the woman looked nice, like she wasn't a threat. The third report came from a woman named Savannah. She and I were hanging out at my house with her niece, Lainey, and it was in the summer of 2016. We stayed later than expected, and I drove them to the porch and followed them inside to lock up. Savannah stopped in the enclosed porch, and she froze before opening the door into the dining room. When I asked what was wrong, she whispered, "I saw something." I asked what she meant, and she described the same woman, but the appearance was a little bit different. Savannah said that the woman looked violent, like she was angry enough to hurt someone. She said that the left side of the woman's face was missing skin and had exposing bone. Savannah said that she was walking across the dining room toward the basement door, and I didn't believe her at the time. I thought that she was tired or just trying to freak me out. But as soon as I had that thought, the basement doorknob started shaking uncontrollably. And I mean, it wasn't a slow movement or a rattle caused by vibration or anything. This thing was moving like somebody was trying to break the damn door. It must have lasted about 10 seconds, and then suddenly it just stopped. I really didn't know what to do or think at the time. The rational part of my brain said, well, there's no one there, this is a house, it's old. But the other part of my brain was screaming to me that the house was not empty. I grabbed my keys and I drove Savannah and Lainey home that day. I didn't stay to sleep, and I didn't even go back inside. I stayed inside of my car and just slept in there until the shaking stopped. It was after that night, too, that I started taking the reports more seriously. I realized that what was happening wasn't random. It was consistent with other details, and the figure was always the same woman. The dress was always purple. The hair was the same length and style. The only difference was always her expression. Sometimes calm and sometimes, well, violent is how it was described to me. The most disturbing part is that the woman was never seen in the same area twice, though. The sightings were always in different parts of the house. The attic, the hallway, outside near the porch. That suggests that the house itself was the location of the activity, and not a specific room. I eventually stopped sleeping in the house for long periods as well. I stopped spending time in the attic, and I stopped going down into the basement alone as well. I told my parents, and they brushed it off as just old house stuff, but I could tell that they were uneasy as well. The house has been sold since then, and I don't live there anymore, thankfully. The last I heard was that the new owners never stayed overnight, and they just kept it as a rental property. And apparently, people come and go all the time. That in itself feels a bit like confirmation to me as well. Now, if there is a logical explanation for all of this, well, I personally never found it. The house was not structurally compromised. The windows and the doors were all functional. There was no evidence of people living in the house or trespassing or anything like that. No one ever really had a reason to scare us, but the fact that multiple independent witnesses described the same figure, and the fact that the doorknob moved on its own and I witnessed that myself, is not something that I can just explain away. The only thing that I can really say is, well, this. I left that house because I felt unsafe. Not because I believed in ghosts, not because I wanted to avoid a story or anything, but because the house behaved like it had a presence inside of it. It's the best way that I can put it. I don't know what it was, but I will certainly never be going back. My uncle rarely talks about this incident, and when he does, he avoids any details that might sound like a ghost story. He describes it in a way that makes it feel more like a report, because I guess that's how he processes it. What I mean is that he's just not the kind of person to embellish. So this happened in a rural area of Nebraska, where farms are spread out and each property has its own house. The nearest neighbor, they were at least a mile away, and people in that region are used to isolation. They're used to being alone at night. My uncle was close to a man from a neighboring farm. His name was Dale, and they were related through the extended family tree, so they were both neighbors and sort of distant cousins. They worked together sometimes and shared tools and often drank together after long days. But drinking was a part of their social life, and Dale was known for being especially heavy. His family had stopped trying to control it, and it was really just how he lived. One evening, though, Dale didn't come home. At first, nobody worried. I mean, he often disappeared for a night or two and would show up somewhere down the road the next day. People assumed that he had passed out in a field or a barn or something. But a week went by without any sign of him, and that's when people started looking. They found him on the side of a highway, in a drainage ditch. He had been hit by a vehicle, and his body had been there long enough for decomposition to be advanced. The official conclusion was that he had been struck, and he was thrown into the ditch and left undiscovered for several days. It was a tragic accident, and the family accepted it as such as well. The detail, though, that mattered later was that Dale and my uncle had purchased matching shirts a few months before his death. They were expensive shirts too, bought for special events, weddings, church gatherings, celebrations. The shirts were identical in style and pattern. They were the kind of clothing that a man would keep for years and only wear occasionally. In late January, my uncle had to travel to a wedding about 80 miles away, and he wore the matching shirt because he wanted to look presentable, and it was really the only clean one that he had that fit the dress code. The wedding, it ended pretty late that day, and he drove home as far as the highway, then parked his truck because he didn't want to risk driving in a heavy fog like this while he was so tired. The area was pretty dark, the roads were empty, and he didn't want to wake anyone. So he parked up and he chose to walk the remaining distance, about 4 miles through fields and along a gravel track. He walked slowly at first. I mean, it was winter and the cold made him move carefully. The route crossed a small bridge over a drainage canal, and there were no streetlights. The only visibility came from the moon and the headlights of passing trucks every now and then. He was halfway across the bridge too when he suddenly heard laughter. Not a distant laugh too, and not a muffled sound. A clear human laugh coming from the side of the road. Upon hearing it, he stopped. He looked around and saw a man standing near the guardrail facing him. It was Dale. Not a blurred figure and not a shadow, but a fully visible man standing in winter clothing, the same posture that he used to have, the same expression even. He was looking directly at my uncle, and his face was familiar in a way that made my uncle's stomach tighten. Dale spoke without moving his lips in a way that could be mistaken for a trick of light, but the voice was audible and normal, but the words just didn't make sense. But then he said, "Oh, you're wearing the shirt." My uncle didn't stop to question it. He didn't stand there to prove that he was sane. Instead, he ran. He ran without looking back, across the bridge, into the fields, over uneven ground. He ran for nearly 3 miles, and he said that later that his lungs felt like they were burning and his legs felt like they were about to collapse under him. When he reached home, he was shaking as well, and he was sweating in freezing weather. He didn't say a word. He ripped off the shirt immediately, threw it into the yard, and set it on fire with a lighter. Only after the shirt was destroyed did he tell his family what he had seen. His family didn't believe him at first. They assumed that he was tired or affected by alcohol or stress or something. But the next morning, his other cousin, Dale's sister, called. She said that she had seen the same man apparently. She was driving home from the town store at around 10, and she had crossed the same bridge, and she saw a figure standing near the guardrail staring at the road. She didn't stop, but she did call her husband afterward and told him that she felt like she had seen someone who shouldn't have been there. Then Dale's mother called, and she said that she had been out walking her dog near the canal earlier that week, and she saw a man standing on the bridge as well, who she thought was Dale, but she knew that he was dead, and so she turned around and left immediately. After that, nobody in the family ever went near that bridge at night again. The part that made it worse, though, was that the sightings were not limited to one person. Multiple family members reported seeing the same figure in the same location, wearing the same clothing. That was not something that anyone could rationalize away as a hallucination or a coincidence. And trust me, these people aren't the sort of people to make stories up like this. After this, the family stopped speaking openly about it too. They didn't want to attract attention, and they didn't want anyone to think that they were unstable as well. But the bridge, it became a place that nobody would cross at night. Even people who lived in the area for decades avoided it. And that's what really made the story real for me, the behavior change. My uncle still avoids wearing anything that reminds him of that shirt, and he says that he never felt comfortable in that area again too. I guess that's the thing that really bothers me the most as well. If it was just grief or stress, then why did the figure appear only when my uncle wore the matching shirt? If it was a hallucination, why did other people see the same thing? If it was an accident, then why did it happen at the same bridge in the same conditions with the same clothing? The only answer that my family has ever offered is that something about that shirt, something about the shared ownership, that it triggered the event. My uncle doesn't call it a ghost. He doesn't label it at all, in fact. He just always says it was him. It was the only thing that made sense, and it was not something that I want to ever see again. I'm currently sitting in my car outside of an inn in rural Vermont, writing this down because I don't want to forget the events of last night. My partner and I both have histories with old houses. His family home was investigated for paranormal activity, and mine is like over 200 years old. We consider ourselves reasonably sensitive to environmental phenomena that most people dismiss. But what happened last night, it tested that sensitivity in a way that neither of us expected. We checked in at around 4, and we had a small second-floor room near the back of the building. Almost immediately, too, I felt the sensation of something brushing past my upper back. Initially, I assumed it was air movement from the old heating system or just my imagination. And so we set up our equipment, a spirit box, an electronic bell, and a small motion-activated toy that we used to detect sudden movement. For the first hour, nothing unusual occurred beyond the building's typical creaks and the occasional jostle of doors from other guests or maybe some wind. But at about 5:15, I was in the bathroom when the motion toy across from the sink suddenly activated. I checked it repeatedly, touched the desk, moved around the toy, even tapped it to see if it was just malfunctioning. Nothing triggered it after the initial activation, and later, during a tour of the basement, we realized that this spot corresponded exactly to where a previous guest had reported a serious incident involving a fall in the cellar. After dinner, though, we returned to the room with a bottle of wine and resumed the testing equipment. The spirit box produced nothing meaningful, and my partner and I were sort of preparing for bed when, around 10:30, several events occurred simultaneously. The motion toy began activating on its own, the electrical bell chimed without input, and a faint perfume-like scent filled the room. My partner, already exhausted, told me to ignore it and just to try to go to sleep. Now, at around 11:30, while my partner was asleep, I heard dragging noises coming from the attic. The noise suggested heavy objects being moved and then dropped, and following that I heard footsteps in the hallway outside of my room. I woke my partner, who instructed me to stay calm, and after a brief pause in the noises, I returned to bed, but I remained alert for sure. At 12:30, I had been asleep only for about 15 minutes when the motion toy activated continuously, accompanied by the same perfume smell. I had to use the bathroom at this point, but I hesitated. At 1 a.m., I finally walked past the device. Nothing triggered it physically, but when I returned to the bed, the footsteps resumed. At around 1:45, I verbally prompted any presence to interact with the device, and the toy immediately began going off. My partner stayed awake with me after that until I could calm down. By 3 o'clock, he was awake as well, and there were 6 hard knocks on the door, followed by an attempt to turn the doorknob multiple times. The door was locked, but the force and the repetition were enough to make both of us very tense. Without warning, too, the bed shifted violently as if somebody had grabbed it and pulled it. The sounds of footsteps continued from the hallway outside of our room, and my partner, who had experienced much worse in his youth, remained calm while I was completely frozen. By 4 a.m., I had personally reached my limit. The combination of repeated knocks, aggressive bed movement, and continuous footsteps created a sense of targeted energy that I couldn't ignore anymore. And so, I decided to leave the room and spent the remainder of that night in the car. My partner eventually joined me after dawn, and we didn't speak about the events much until this morning. We documented the occurrences on video and audio for later review, and while some events could plausibly be attributed to building noises, drafts, or faulty equipment, several aspects could not. The consistent activation of the motion toy at precise locations without physical contact, that was weird. The synchronized timing of the bell, the toy, and the sensory perception, the perfume scent at night. The aggressive knocking and door manipulation while the room was locked, and obviously the bed movement appearing independent of any person's actions or movement. At this point, the experience is classified for us as highly unusual but unexplained. We have no physical injuries or losses or anything, and the building itself is structurally sound. However, the psychological impact, it has definitely had a very significant effect on me. We're reviewing the footage and audio recordings carefully, looking for plausible explanations, but at this time, the events remain unaccounted for. I'm not sharing this as well to detail everything, but more for anyone analyzing phenomena, that these patterns, location-specific, time-specific, and multisensory. Anyway, the night ended without any further escalation once we moved out to the car, but the inn remains off limits to me until more controlled testing can be conducted. And while I don't claim to understand or I couldn't identify the source, the night definitely serves as a bit of a case study in places like this. This happened on January 2nd of 2019 in Bristol, England, in my parents' home. My sister and her partner and we were staying there because they were between apartments. My parents were out of the country for a week, and the house itself is a normal suburban build, nothing historic or unusual. The only odd thing really is the hallway. It has a long, straight line of sight from the living room to the front door, with no doors or breaks in the corridor. To be honest, it feels like a really long tunnel almost. The kind of hallway where you can't see around corners or anything. Now, the day started like most after a New Year's night. I was pretty exhausted, hungover, and emotionally drained. I had walked home from a party the night before, about 7 kilometers away, and it took me nearly 3 hours to get home. I was physically okay, but I was just drained. I fell asleep at around 8 a.m. and I must have woken up at around 1 p.m. My family dog Rex was in the house. He's a medium-sized mixed breed and he had a strong routine at the time. When he wanted to go out, he would whine softly and sit by the door, and that morning I woke up to a low, repetitive whine from the foot of the bed. It took a moment for me to register, but it was Rex. So I got up and I put on my coat and I took him outside. The weather was pretty cold that day, about 2 degrees, with wind that made it feel much colder. The walk was uncomfortable, but I didn't feel unsafe. Rex was calm and we returned after 10 minutes and I let him loose in the living room eventually. He immediately became playful, running around and pushing at my legs like he wanted attention. I gave him a chew bone and returned to bed eventually, and I must have gone back to sleep or fallen asleep for a few hours. I woke up at around 3, made some coffee, and sat down in the living room to eat a little bit. The living room is open plan and visible from most parts of the house. The hallway is the only place that you can't see from there, and it leads to the bathrooms and the bedrooms, and the front door obviously. But even during the day, the hallway just always has a different feel to it, like the air changes when you cross that threshold. I've never really liked that passage too, not because I believe in ghosts, but because my body reacts to it. It triggers a sort of stress response, I guess, a sharp tightening across the shoulders, and a rush of adrenaline and the feeling of being watched from behind. Not in a vague way too, but in a very specific and sort of physical way, like somebody is close enough to touch my neck. Well, that day I noticed it again while I was eating. I felt a pressure behind me as if someone had stepped into the hallway and was standing there waiting. I didn't turn around immediately. I waited for the feeling to pass, but this time it didn't. Instead, the sensation intensified, like the pressure was shifting closer. I kept my eyes on the TV, trying to convince myself that it was just my anxiety. I mean, I was still hungover, and that kind of thing can exaggerate normal fear responses. At around 10:30 p.m., my sister and her partner returned from their own New Year's celebration. The house was quiet, Rex was calm, just lying on the rug. We spoke for a few minutes and then decided to watch a movie. We all sat on the couch. My sister's partner had a beer and she didn't because she was pregnant. I was tired and I felt a bit unsettled. Now, at about 11:45, we decided to go to bed. The three of us went to our separate rooms and I lay down and put on a YouTube video to fall asleep and sort of drifted. I wasn't asleep for long though when I heard footsteps, and they were coming from the hallway. Not slow steps and not cautious ones. It sounded like someone was walking quickly toward the front door, then the sound of the door opening, a clear, heavy click. The door shut, and it was the sound of somebody walking inside. The moment that the door closed, Rex started barking as well, and not a normal bark. It was frantic, urgent, and panicked. He ran to the hallway and stopped. His barking stopped abruptly too. He stood perfectly still, staring down the corridor. That was the moment that I realized that something was wrong. I was already pretty tense, but my body tightened further at this stage. The feeling that I had in the hallway earlier returned in full force as well. The same pressure, the same sense of being watched from behind, but now it was paired with something else. Anger. It wasn't a friendly presence. Whatever this was, it was hostile. I heard my sister's room door open and her partner came out. We both stepped into the hallway at the same time and we looked at each other. The hallway was empty. The front door was closed, locked even. There was no sound of movement beyond the walls, and the air was still. We checked the bathrooms, and there was no one there. We checked the windows, but nothing. There was no evidence of anyone outside. We looked for footprints in the snow. We turned on the porch light and went outside with our phone flashlights. The outside area was fully visible. There was a driveway, a small front garden, and a fence. The street was quiet. There were no cars, no pedestrians, nothing. It didn't take long to realize that the sound that we had heard could not have come from a person entering and leaving, though. The timeline just didn't fit. It would have taken longer to open the door and enter and close it, and move around without being seen like that. We returned inside, confused and really tense. My sister's partner tried to make sense of it logically. He suggested that the door could have been left unlocked and someone could have come in without our knowledge. He said the house might have shifted, making noises. But we all knew that that just wasn't the case. We heard footsteps clearly. We heard the door open and close. We heard the sound of somebody walking in. And we all felt it apparently too. The pressure, the hostility, the feeling that something had been waiting in the hallway and had just stepped into the house. My sister's partner stayed skeptical, but she and I were not. She has had similar experiences in that house before, and she was visibly shaken by this. She didn't say much, but her body language was enough to show that she believed it. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting in the living room, the lights on, the doors locked, and the phones ready. Nothing else happened, at least not that night. But after that, it stopped being just a weird thing and became something that we avoided actively. The hallway became a sort of boundary that we didn't cross unless absolutely necessary. We stopped staying in the house overnight, and we stopped letting Rex wander alone at night. We installed additional locks on the front door, and my parents later told us that they had experienced similar incidences too. Not the same exact event, but the same sort of pattern. The sound of somebody entering, Rex barking, the hallway feeling wrong, and then nothing being there. It happened multiple times over the years, always in the same location, and always with the same physical sensation. But here's the weirdest thing. So the strange part is that all of these incidences stopped after the front door was replaced with a modern automatic lock. It was, for all intents and purposes, a complete solution. Everything stopped. I don't know what caused it, and I don't know whether it was human, an animal, or something else. I only know that whatever it was real, and that the hallway is not a normal space by any means. If you've ever felt that sudden intense sort of sensation of being watched or chased from behind, upstairs, or in a hallway, and it felt like more than just your imagination, I think you'll understand what I'm describing here, because that's exactly what this was like. What do you guys think? Based on what I've described, do you think that this was paranormal, or is there another way to explain it? In late 2012, I was alone in my flat in a working-class area of Birmingham. My partner had taken our son to visit her parents for the weekend, and I was editing a short film project at the dining table under a deadline that I couldn't miss. The work took longer than expected, and I didn't stop until 10 p.m. I was tired, hungry, and I knew that I had to get out for a break before my focus completely collapsed. I decided to walk to the nearest pub for a quick drink and to buy some food on the way back. I grabbed my jacket and shut the front door behind me. The building was a terraced house converted into flats, with the front door opening directly onto the sidewalk. As I pulled the door closer, I heard a voice in my ear that was not spoken aloud, but sounded like someone standing right behind me. It was a direct insult, racially charged and aggressive, delivered in a clear tone that matched the local accent. I reacted immediately, turning around with the intent to confront whoever was there. But the street was empty. Nobody was visible in the immediate area. and there were no sounds indicating that somebody was even nearby. I stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize what had happened. The logical explanation was that I had imagined it. The irrational explanation was that someone had been close enough to whisper, but had completely disappeared. I chose the rational option, telling myself that I was stressed and tired, and I continued toward the pub. I walked down the underpass that led underneath the main road, then across 2 side streets. The route required crossing a major road that cut through the center of town. The pedestrian crossing was a few meters ahead, but when I reached it, the streetlight wasn't working. The area was poorly lit, and the road noise made it difficult to hear anything other than the traffic. At that moment, 3 men appeared from the darkness near the underpass exit. They were dressed in heavy boots and jackets with close-cropped hair. They stepped into the street in a loose formation, speaking loudly. The words that they said were the same racist insult that I had heard earlier, repeated exactly in the same order, and with the same cadence even. The situation became immediately dangerous. I had no time to think beyond one objective: get out of their range. I moved quickly across the road, using the barriers as a cover, and stopped at a safer distance on the sidewalk. I turned to face them and spoke loudly, not because I was confident, but because I wanted to appear unafraid. I used the only strategy that I could think of at the time: assert dominance through noise and posture. The men, they stopped advancing. They stayed at the edge of the dark area watching me. Their body language suggested that they were waiting to see whether I would back down or not. I maintained eye contact until they turned away and eventually disappeared into the darkness. When I reached the pub, my hands were shaking. I didn't drink, and I ate quickly and returned home immediately. I didn't feel relieved until I was inside that flat with the door locked behind me that day. The most troubling part of the event is not the encounter itself as well, but timing of the warning. The voice in my ear occurred minutes before the attack, and if I had not have heard it, I think that I would have approached the crossing without caution. I would have been unaware of the threat until it was too late. That warning, it gave me an edge that prevented a potential fatal situation. Over the years, I have had other incidences that could be classified as intuition or premonition, but none with the same level of immediacy or consequence like this. When I later learned too, through a DNA test, that I had Jamaican and West African ancestry, I connected it to a family story that I had never fully understood. My paternal relatives told me that my grandmother was known for experiencing strong warnings before significant events. She described them as sudden sensations, often accompanied by a feeling of danger that forced her to change her actions. I don't fully claim to understand what happened that night. I don't know whether the voice was a psychological response, a coincidence, or something else. But the event, it stayed with me because the outcome was measurable. I was warned, and I avoided harm that day. The warning, it didn't save me from a minor threat too. It potentially prevented a serious injury, or maybe something even worse than that. My name is Raphael, and look, I'm not trying to convince anyone that spirits exist or anything. I'm only sharing an experience that still affects me, and I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. I grew up in a community where spiritual practice is pretty common, so to me, this is pretty normal. My family, they're involved in a traditional religion that includes spirit work, and I've always had the ability to see things that others don't. Most of my relatives, they experience spirits through possession or trance, but my perception has always been direct. I see them, and sometimes they even communicate with me. My mother Maria, she is the most spiritually advanced person in the family. She regularly speaks out loud to spirits at home, and nobody questions it. My siblings are also spiritually sensitive, but their experiences are a bit different. I'm the only one who can really clearly see and interact with spirits outside of ritual settings. Now, this event happened when I was between 11 and 13 years old. I can't recall the exact year, but I do remember the sequence clearly. At that time, our family was under a lot of financial pressure, and we had to move into a small rented house. I ended up sharing a room with my older adopted sister and our cousin, who had recently returned from rehabilitation. At the time, I really didn't understand what was happening with her, but she was going through withdrawal and was likely using again. Her behavior was unpredictable, and her mood was consistently negative. One night during a hot summer, I went to bed at my usual time, at around 3 in the morning. Yes, I know, pretty crazy, but I woke up suddenly with a strong sensation of danger. It wasn't a physical pressure, but it felt like an alarm in my body telling me that something was wrong. I looked around the room and noticed a tall figure standing over my cousin's bed. It was too tall to be a normal person as well, and its shape was distorted like a shadow stretched by the light. It had no hair, no visible facial features, and its presence felt completely hostile. I remained still, watching it for what I estimated to be about half an hour. I didn't feel physically unable to move or anything, but I just chose not to. I was waiting for it to leave, really, but it didn't. I began to question whether I was imagining it as well, so I decided to test myself. I got up, walked to the bathroom, drank some water, and splashed my face. And when I returned, the entity had moved. It was now positioned above my adopted sister's bed, silently watching her sleep. The change was not subtle, too. My sister looked normal and calm, though, and the figure above her was still present and seemed to be waiting for something. In any case, I went back to my bed and I tried to get some sleep, but I stayed awake for hours, watching the figure from the corner of my eye. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. When I woke again, the entity was now above my bed. It was directly over me, looking down at my face, and I wanted to shout, but I remembered the advice that my mother had given me: do not show fear. So I stayed quiet and I tried to act as if I didn't see it. I closed my eyes and I didn't move or react. The next morning, everything was normal again. My sister and cousin were fine and there were no signs of anything unusual. The entity didn't return, but I've never forgotten the feeling of being watched by something that didn't belong to the same world as us. Whatever this thing was, it was evil and it didn't belong here. I've encountered other spirits since then, but this was the only one that ever made me feel genuinely unsafe. It wasn't a simple presence. It felt like a predator assessing its target. Since that night, whenever I sense a spirit that feels negative as well, I avoid acknowledging it and I keep my expression neutral and pretend that I don't see it, because I don't want to attract attention or provoke something. Like I said, I'm not sharing this to try and convince anyone, but I just want to get it off my chest, and so yeah, thanks for listening. I'm sharing this because it felt more like an incident than a dream. So I'm 25 and I have a younger brother who is 18. We were both living in Glasgow at the time, and the event happened in early autumn, around 2 in the morning, after a family dinner. The night started normally. My brother and I went out to eat with some relatives and a few people that our family had recently met. A young woman introduced herself to our table, and then she directly greeted my brother. He didn't respond, though. He didn't even look up. I spoke for him because he seemed distracted and sort of uncomfortable, and I tried to make it socially normal. Anyway, after dinner we took the bus home, and I teased him about ignoring the girl, trying to keep the mood light. He was clearly annoyed by this, but he didn't react aggressively. The conversation was pretty casual, similar to how we normally speak when we're just joking. While we were on the bus, I felt a sudden sense of dread, though, which just sort of came out of nowhere. The driver was a man in his early 30s with long hair and a lazy manner. He was driving aggressively and seemed really distracted. Without warning, too, the bus hit a small car ahead of us. The car disappeared out of view, but the bus didn't slow down. I looked at my brother, and he was visibly frightened too. Then I looked forward and saw a rear of a large truck directly in our path. It appeared as though we were about to hit it as well, because it was stationary and we were moving at pretty high speed. The collision almost happened instantly. Everything went dark and I experienced a sensation of uncontrolled spinning, like being thrown around inside of a confined space. I repeated my brother's name over and over, and it wasn't emotional or dramatic, more survival instinct, I guess. The impact continued for like several seconds though, with my body moving violently and repeatedly against the interior of the bus. At some point though, I woke up inside of the same scene. The pain felt real but muted, like it was happening through a barrier, and I could sense broken ribs and a fractured left arm. My legs were unresponsive and my mouth tasted metallic. I've broken bones before, so the sensations were pretty familiar to me, but the intensity was unlike any dream that I had ever had. I called out to my brother. He was behind me, leaning against the window. He could move his head, but not his limbs, and he told me that he couldn't feel his legs, and so I attempted to drag myself forward using my right arm, and the pain in my ribs and shoulder increased. My lower body felt heavy and numb, and I could hear my own breathing and the faint sound of sirens in the distance. I couldn't tell if this was real or just a part of a dream. I tried to reassure him. I told him to stay calm and that help was coming. I said the same thing multiple times. Not because I believed that they would fix anything, but because it genuinely felt like the only response available. I told him to tell our parents and older brother that I loved them. I felt blood in my mouth and my vision started to blur, and the last thing that I remember was feeling sleepy, as if my body was shutting down. Then I woke up for real. My heart was racing, my chest hurt slightly, like a muscle strain, my mouth tasted faintly metallic, and the room was quiet. I lay still for several minutes, trying to separate the memory from reality, and I just couldn't shake the feeling that what I had experienced had a structure and logic that normal dreams just don't have. It was a nightmare with symbolic elements. It was a sequence of events with clear physical sensations, and it felt like it followed the rules of real life. That's why it was so terrifying to me at the time and why I remembered it so vividly. But here's the really weird thing. So, later that month, there was a crash in that area from my dream. It was a bus and it ran straight into the back of a large truck. I won't go into all of the gruesome details, but long story short, there was a woman, a young woman, who was working in a restaurant nearby who had caught that bus and who had died on the scene. I'm not sure of what to make of any of this, but writing it down helped slightly, and I don't plan on sleeping again tonight. But if anyone has any insight into what any of this could have been, then I would really appreciate some feedback. This happened in February of 2020. I live in the central Arkansas area for reference too. So my buddy's grandparents owned some farmland about 15 to 20 minutes outside of our town, and we would regularly spend the night out there on weekends with some of our other friends. We would make a fire, drink, etc. And this particular weekend, it was just him and I. It was pretty dark by the time that we got there, but it was the standard fare. We had decided to set up the fire on the dirt path that ran from my friend's grandparents' house through their field to the woods. But this day we built the fire closer to the middle of the field. Not long after we get the fire started, we sit down and get some music going and crack open our first beers. He turns off the music and notices something in the sky behind me. My back was facing the woods, so I turned to look. There was a bright light in the sky above the tree line. I wasn't too weirded out by this, and neither was he. However, I had never seen a star that bright before. I opened up his Stargazer app on my phone that I had had forever, thinking that we were close to a planet or something. But before I could even point my phone in that direction, the star suddenly moved. At this point, we both froze. The light moved quickly and smoothly to the right, without any bobs or waves or anything, and was utterly silent. That was when I noticed that the light was coming from some kind of flying vehicle and was actually much closer than we thought. It was probably 300 to 400 feet away, flying above the woods. This thing was also incredibly fast, too fast to move that quietly without making any sort of noise. It was dark though, and I couldn't make out exactly what the vehicle was, and the bright light emitting from its side sort of obscured any good look. But it moved perfectly parallel with the tree line, just right above it. And it was like it had left when it noticed that we had noticed it. We continued watching as the UFO just quickly and quietly moved on in a straight line until it was beyond our sight a few seconds later. We just sort of looked at each other like, what the heck was that? And began to discuss what we had just seen, sort of in hushed tones like we were dreaming. 20 minutes or so later, we hear a noise coming from the sky and see two loud planes flying side by side, going exactly the direction that the UFO had gone. At this point, we started to think that it was a military drone of some kind, and we didn't see or hear anything else that night, so we thought that it was that. I still think about it every now and then though, and I don't know, the whole military drone just doesn't really add up to me. I decided to share this in looking for some other people's opinions, so what do you all think? What do you think it could have been? When I was 16 and my sister was 14, we used to go to our grandma's house every day after school to take care of her barn cats. And before we went, we always stopped at this one and only little grocery store in our town, and we would get a soda and some little Debbie cakes and dispose of the evidence in the barn burn barrels so our parents wouldn't get mad. One day though, we were in the store and my sister and I were at opposite ends of an aisle. I went to walk around to the next and I was looking down at the floor like I always do. I have social anxiety and I avoid eye contact at all costs. So I saw a pair of worn brown boots first, work boots like all the men in town wore. Nothing crazy, but then I saw jeans worn too. And it felt like slow motion, but then I saw the hands, swollen, bulbous and wet, pale white like a dead body. I immediately felt chills run down my spine and I continued looking up. It felt like slow motion, but I saw this button-down red flannel shirt. And then that was when I saw his face. It was like it was melting. His mouth was just a black hole, and I believe his eyes were too. I didn't look for more than half a second before my flight instinct forced me to turn around and walk back down the aisle. I wanted to run, but I was so scared that he would chase me if I ran, so I very purposely kept my regular pace and walked to my sister before I turned around to make sure that he wasn't following me. Thankfully, he wasn't. I told my sister, "You need to go down the aisle and look to your left right now." She was laughing, thinking that it was a cute boy or something like that, and I'm like, "Dude, no, I'm being serious, you need to look." So she walked down and I stayed a few paces behind her. When she reached the end of the aisle, she froze, staring in front of her like she was seeing a ghost. Her fear response was to freeze, and I said her name and she didn't react. She was completely frozen at this stage. I tried again and she didn't answer, so in the end I grabbed her arm and yanked her, and we both ran as fast as we could back down the aisle and to the other side of the store. We were both shaking by this point. I asked her what she saw, and she described exactly what I had seen. Whatever it was not human. There is no way that anybody could ever convince me that it was. And the energy around it was so foul and rotten. We had both had experiences with the paranormal before, but genuinely it was nothing like this. We looked around to see if anyone else was scared, but everyone else was just being normal, like they hadn't even seen it. I told her that we should ask them to check the cameras, but she said no way that they would let us and they'd probably just call us crazy. I knew that she was right about that too, so in the end we just left. Then that night, she woke up and saw it, standing in a doorway, so she squeezed her eyes shut and didn't open them until morning apparently. I never saw it again personally, and I'm convinced that the second time that she saw it, it must have been sleep paralysis, a nightmare or hallucination from the fear that she'd felt earlier. We went to Catholic school at the time, and so my sister was so affected by this that she went to speak to the parish priest. Unfortunately, he was no help at all. He said people in our state, we went to a school in the next state over, are crazy, and it was probably just a guy in a mask or something. And if I have ever been sure about anything in my life, I know that it was not a mask. I know that. I don't know what it was, but whatever it is, it wasn't human. To this day, my sister cannot speak about it. It affected her a lot, and she's scared to talk about it because she's worried that it might draw it back towards her. I don't really know why I'm sharing this, but I guess because I need to talk to someone about it. Because the only person who would actually believe me, because she saw it too, she just cannot talk about it. So please, do let me know what your thoughts are about this, because I need to talk to someone. I would like to preface this by saying that working at my job has completely changed my perspective on the paranormal. For context, I work at a vintage store that specializes in old antique Western American artifacts. The store is located in a wealthy part of the state, where a lot of wealthy people buy in bulk to decorate their second and third homes. This means that we have a lot of sourced items being moved in and out of the store at all times. I'm not part of the sourcing by any means. I simply sell items and help manage the store. But most, if not all, of the items obviously have sort of energy attached to them, I guess. Not always good either. Within 3 months of working there too, I knew that it was haunted, and that the resident spirits had taken a liking to me. With the coming and going of items, certain energies and events occur and stop too. Now, things were sort of weird from the beginning, I guess, but I always chalked it up to being a somewhat old building. One morning I was opening the store on my own. It was the dead of winter and everything was very dark and snowed in. But the moment that I walk in, it is absolutely freezing. I think that the heater conked out in the night. I go to turn it on and see that it's working perfectly fine though, and the warmth that it's emitting seems to be dissipating after a couple of feet. I ignore it and turn on the main floor lights. I walk downstairs where it's pitch black. This is where we keep the majority of our vintage items. And before I can turn on the lights, our music turns on at full blast. Problem is that the music isn't an automatic system. I mean, I control it myself from my phone, and I had yet to turn the system on. I was the only one in the building and around the general vicinity, so no one else could have turned it on from their phone. After calming down from the scare, I turn on the lights to discover that all the pillows have been thrown off of our massive vintage leather couch. I still think it's weird, but I'm trying to rationalize it by saying maintenance must have come in the night to fix something, and they did that. I clean them up and walk upstairs again to find all the lights are now turned on. I clean them up and I walk upstairs again to find that all the lights that I've just turned on have suddenly gone out. The light switches are switched off again, not just the power too. Again, I ignore it and turn them on again and walk outside to open the front door and turn our open sign on. And this is the moment where I realized everything. Our locally made chapstick display, a heavy thing, gets completely swept off the shelf, like someone aggressively pushed it off in front of me. To be clear too, it didn't fall, the shelf didn't budge, it was pushed off 100%. 50 to 100 chapsticks go flying everywhere, and the acrylic case shatters into pieces. The music system suddenly starts playing the music very loudly again. and honestly, I'm just frozen in shock. Things suddenly go very quiet though. It was as if it or they just wanted me to finally acknowledge it. The computer screen turned on seconds later, as if it was telling me to get to work now, and I think I must have stood there for a solid 10 minutes, just frozen, not knowing what to do. Now, on another occasion, and this took place around 4 months ago, our main vintage collector had brought in old vintage mirrors that he'd found in different places and constructed a wall of them on the side of the stairs going down. I came back from vacation slightly horrified, to be honest. I feel like mirrors just hold really bad energy, especially ones owned by other people before. But it was a normal day at work, helping customers, logging inventory, etc. But one of the employees was working with me and we were casually chatting about life. Eventually, she went downstairs to help a customer with finding the price on a vintage fur coat and some artwork, I think. It was when the customer's daughter is walking upstairs, aka passing the mirror wall, that she suddenly screams. I, being the person in charge, run toward the screen to check on everything. This girl is inconsolable though, and claiming that she saw a shadowy figure in the mirror. The mum is calming her daughter, saying that it's just a shadow, sweetie. I investigate and I don't see anything. Just the normal bad feeling that I experience passing those mirrors. We help this lady and she eventually leaves with her items. A couple of hours later, a different woman wants to buy a wall coat rack right by the mirrors. As I'm using the drill to remove the coat rack, and my coworker is holding the other end of the coat rack, her face suddenly pales. She's staring at the mirrors and can't look away. I see her do a double take and continue to stare at them. Obviously, I'm concerned and finish helping this lady out. Immediately after she leaves, I return back to my coworker who is still just staring at the mirrors. It's as if she was in a trance sort of state. I shake her out of it and she can't speak. It's only when she said my name and I look back at the mirrors that I see the same figure. A morphing figure, subtly taking on different appearances. Some feminine, others masculine, no face, just features. Used to these things around here by now, I drag her upstairs and sort of ignore it. The rest of the day though, I heard from multiple customers about how they thought that they were seeing things in that same mirror. One girl even threw up in the bathroom because she said that she suddenly felt so sick walking downstairs. When I came back for my shift the next week, it was gone. My other co-worker had informed me that apparently it didn't sell, but one of the other employees walked down one day to find it cracked. I don't know what happened to it or where it went, but the rest of the mirrors are still there. All of the relatively younger employees seem to experience things too, but not as much as I do. The older employees, they don't seem to experience as much, but they agree that there are weird things that happen here. We also have some seemingly nice or playful resident spirits, I guess you could call them. They like to flick light switches on and off, make knocks that can't be blamed on the building, play with the building's temperature, and mess with items on shelves and all that. Occasionally, they like to make messes and play tricks too, throwing pillows off couches, Jellycat stuffed animals being rearranged in the night, make sounds to scare people, and sometimes switch the music playing and play with the volume levels too. Generally, things that happen here are harmless, not to mention that they love to play with our security camera system too. We've had the cameras and the electricals looked at 1,000,000 times and they all work fine, but things will stop recording and cut out all the time. In any case, on another occasion I was approaching the end of my shift, which means cleaning up and organizing the store for the next day's employees. I clean up our vintage toy area and walk behind the shelves to organize our vintage Levi jeans rack. I hear a clatter and go to investigate, thinking that something had just fallen over. Kids place things back on shelves in precarious situations, and things fall all the time. Not always because of the activity, is what I'm getting at. So I walk over to the toy corner and see a knocked over toy train, standing up though, which was a bit weird. This thing doesn't run on batteries or anything, it's super old, but I watch as it starts moving at a moderate pace, out of the corner and into the next aisle section. But once again, it's just a model train. No strings, no batteries, no track, nothing. It stops after about maybe 6-ish feet of movement. After my initial internal screaming, I decide to leave it there for whatever is moving it. I hesitantly ignore it and go back to cleaning. No more sound or movement, and right before I close up, I put the train back on the shelf. On another occasion, I sold a customer an old turquoise sort of Native American ring. It was on sale, so no returns. A week later, she calls though and begs for a return. She drives literally an hour back to the store and says that she doesn't want the ring anymore. I think to myself, someone regrets spending the money they did, and I get it. But then she goes on to say that things have been so weird in her house since she bought it. She said that her cats were acting up, the house was making weird noises, and doors were closing on their own. I wasn't supposed to take it back due to policy and all that, but we worked something out in the end. I mean, she seemed so frantic. Sometimes you'd think someone is making something up to get their money back, as it happens in retail, but genuinely, she seemed really scared. And based on my experiences working at my job, I didn't doubt her either. Nothing happened in particular after we got the ring back, luckily. It was sold a little bit later to a collector, and we didn't hear anything after that, but still, it was a weird situation. Now, this story is not my own. It's actually my friend's who was visiting at the time. She came to visit me at work. She wanted to try on some vintage clothing, so she goes into the dressing room to try it on. While she's doing that, I go into the next room over to show a customer the bathroom. But when I come back, my friend is sort of shocked to see me walk back into the main shop area. She looks back behind the counter and then back at me, sort of confused. I can tell that she's processing something. She asks, "Were you not in the back room just now?" And I'm confused, seeing as I wasn't and my coworker left early. Now, my friend is a very practical human being. She has to see it to believe it sort of thing. That's her philosophy anyway. But she then goes on to explain that the backroom door, which is slightly visible to the customers, was halfway closed. She said that there was a shadow matching my height and size, making noise back there and moving around. She said that she thought that I was back there grabbing items. She said that she thought that she heard me respond and say "aha" too at one point. Mind you, nobody else was back there and no other customers had come in at that point. When I went to take a look, the figure back there, or whatever it was now long gone. Nothing seemed out of place, but she was absolutely convinced that I must have been back there. Anyway, these are just some of the experiences from this place, and like I said, this place has changed my perspective on things for good, and I don't think I'll ever be the same after working here. This happened a couple of years ago, but I often think about it and what this person's intentions truly were. So, a couple of years ago, probably 2018, me, a 23-year-old male, I was outside of my mother's house close to midnight. It's dark in the neighborhood, nobody is outside, and it's quiet and pretty chill. I'm smoking by my car, just listening to music and vibing pretty quietly, when I see a person walking up the street towards me. Nothing to be alarmed about, but she gets close. She's a cute mid-30s woman. Sees me smoking and asks if I have a cigarette. She was friendly enough, but I say no, unfortunately I don't. But we have a bit of a nice quick chat. And I mean, every young man has fantasies of a cute woman walking towards them looking for something, right? And I mean, you never know, but definitely just a fantasy at this point and wishful thinking. But during our quick chat, probably only a minute or so, she says, "One moment, let me take this call." So she calls her husband, I guess. Don't recall how I knew that, but it was her husband. I believe she must have mentioned him in our chat at some point. This is a bit of an old memory, like I said. But this next bit is what creeped me out. She says on the phone, quietly, sort of under her breath, "Hi honey, oh my goodness, I think I found one." She was excited about it, but in a sort of weird way. Hard to explain, but it definitely sounded sinister. It creeped me out and gave me red flags immediately. Plus, I'm thinking, found what? I already said that I didn't have a cigarette. Plus, she was just walking around the streets. She and her husband are looking for something. What does that even mean, right? So, while she was still on the phone, I just turned around and went inside, and I locked the door. Really, I don't know what to think of it to this day. What could she have meant? I mean, best case is that she wanted like a three-way with her husband or something, which I'm not into at all, but worst case is that they were going to rob me or do something awful and weird. What do you think her deal was? Do you think that I overreacted, or was it a good call in the end? When I was about 3 years old, I'm 41 now, my family, mum, stepdad, older sister and I, moved into a rental home in a nice neighborhood within our small town. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and was way bigger than the house that we came from. However, even though I finally had my own room, my sister and I decided to continue sharing a room and a bed. I think we both felt a bit weird in the new home, but my mum just figured that we'd shared a room for so many years that we were comfortable and would eventually grow out of it. This incident, it happened when I was between the age of 4 and 5, and my sister, she would have been around 8 or 9. Now, the way our room was set up was our bed was in the corner of the room against the wall, and my sister, she slept close to the inside against the wall, and I slept on the outside. We had an oscillating fan against the wall that aimed toward our feet, and just outside of our door was the hall with the bathroom right across the hall. Now one night, my sister woke up to use the bathroom, and for some reason, I felt the need to wake up and look down by my feet. And standing there, at the foot of the bed, closest to my side, was a dark silhouette of my sister. I couldn't make out any facial features, as it was just a dark void of a silhouette standing still there. I could see the fan rotating from behind her, but noticed the strands of her hair didn't move once the wind hit us. I called her name, and got no response. Called her name again and again, but there was no answer or movement. When I looked out into the hallway, I saw the bathroom door closed and the light in the bathroom was on. And as soon as the bathroom door opened, it was gone, and my sister walked into the room. I remember that I was absolutely terrified and began crying. My sister came in and made sure that I was okay, and eventually I must have fallen asleep. My sister eventually came in and she made sure that I was okay, and eventually I must have fallen asleep. But even that young, I remembered the experience the next day, and it would stick with me for all these years. I was a 9.5-year-old boy, so this happened a decade and a half ago now. It was summer vacation. The time was noon, and I just took a shower. Towel wrapped around my waist and dripping wet, I was feeling happy like a good naive boy. I went into my bedroom, which I shared with my parents. I was picking out clothes, and nobody was in the room with me. Almost as soon as I walked in, though, I could feel the ground vibrating, which was weird. As I picked clothes, I felt the vibration was coming from behind me, around my parents' bed. It went on and off like a cycle almost, but each time the vibration came back stronger. I wanted to ignore it and go about my happy day, but eventually I just couldn't ignore it anymore. I put on my shorts, and with t-shirt in my hand, I turned around to see what was going on. It was exactly as I imagined. My parents' bed was shaking for no discernible reason, and it seemed to be coming from underneath. The shaking got so bad that other objects started to shake from the bed, hitting the ground. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped again. But this time, right in front of me, I saw this weird creature crawling out from underneath the bed, about a meter or two away. It was pure black, the blackest thing that I've ever seen in my life. In fact, it was so dark that it was hard to discern features on this thing. It sort of looked like a goofy 2D object, but it definitely had 2 legs, a torso, 2 arms, and a head. It didn't know that I was there, I think, in the room staring at it. It was about my size, and sort of seemed to look around for a second. At the time, I interpreted that as it brushing its shoulder off after crawling. But then, it suddenly stopped. Its eyes turned to me, and I could see fear almost. It seemed to be scared of me more than I was scared of it. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was maybe a fraction of a second. Then, without even moving one bit or making any noise, it just disappeared from my existence, like just blinked out of existence. Obviously, I was terrified. I ran out of the room and I told my parents. They came to check what was going on, but in the end I don't know if they believed me or not. My theory is that if it was real, it was an extra-dimensional creature that I saw that day. And yes, after that, my day was completely ruined. When I was young, me and my family moved into this pretty old house in England, and it was in pretty bad condition when we moved in, so we had to do some renovations to fix it up, and for personal reasons, I had to share a room with my mother, and this is where I would experience most of the ghost stuff. As you came into the room, this is what it would look like. On the left is a wall, and on the right was my little bed. Hugging the left wall was my mother's bed, and a small nightstand, and also, this all took part over the course of about 7 years. So, it started off slow, such as me and my siblings seeing someone at the corner of our eyes while we would play board games late at night, or just feeling like we were being watched. Eventually, though, it evolved to actually seeing it often. Now, although I shared a bedroom with my mother, I would keep all my toys and stuff in my brother's room, so we would often be in there late at night playing or talking. And every time that I would leave the room, the exact same toy would come launching off the shelf it sat on and land at my feet. But my parents, they were big believers in the paranormal, so they would tell us to ignore it and don't pay attention to it. Obviously, we never listened. From there, it would get worse, and it seemed to be targeting me. One night, I was asleep in my mother's room as usual when I suddenly woke and was sitting up. I opened my eyes, and through the little light in the room, I could see a short figure standing by my mother's nightstand and hunched over staring at her. I didn't have time to pay attention to the details, since I immediately started screaming and crying, so loud my mother woke up thinking that I was being murdered, and as soon as my mother woke up, the figure disappeared. She calmed me down and put me back to bed, and honestly I thought it was over, but that was really just the beginning. From that point on, it would be a nearly nightly routine, at least 4 times a week. I would wake up in the middle of the night, sit up and look over to my mother's nightstand, and see the exact same thing. Some sort of figure standing over my mother, and again I would scream and cry and so on. Sometimes my mother would leave a little bit of light turned on for me on her nightstand, but that didn't help either as the figure would still come back night after night. Eventually I managed to identify what it was too. It was a little girl with blonde hair, in a dark blue dress with light blue patterns and flowers on it. Even though I could tell what I was looking at, it still absolutely terrified me, and I would still scream and cry nearly every night. Sometimes it would be in a different spot instead of next to the nightstand, such as standing by the door, looking at me instead of my mother, and sometimes closer to my bed. Eventually, my mother got tired of me waking her by screaming and crying, and she went to see a psychic. This part is crazy, I know, but she described what was happening to us every night to the psychic, and the psychic told my mother that it's a little girl called Samantha that has been following my mother since she was a child, and she acts as a guardian angel of sorts. That's why she was always watching over my mother as she slept. The psychic also drew an image of the little girl, which my mother showed me once she came home, and I immediately started bawling because, I kid you not, it was the exact same girl. We have since moved out of that house and I no longer live with my mother, but I do have plenty more experiences from that house and in others that I've lived in.